Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome Dan Willis. He is one of the Disclosure Project's top secret military witnesses that testified at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. in 2001 in front of the major mainstream media of the world. He is an ex-radio broadcast engineer and ABC newsman and has taken a keen interest in how the mainstream media has withheld disclosure of the full message to the public. He works to expose a system that is used to control the public's perception that forms our agreed-upon reality. This is done in order to hide their illegal operations and also why they fear disclosing the truth about the extraterrestrial reality. Dan, welcome. How are you tonight?
Oh, good to be on your show, Chris.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. We've got a lot to talk about. I'd like to start off by saying something that one of my friend Jim Goodall told me. I'm sure you know Jim. Ben Rich of Lockheed Martin supposedly told him on his deathbed, Jim, we have things out in the desert that are 50 years beyond what you can comprehend. If you've seen it on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've been there, done that, or decided it wasn't worth the effort. Now, these types of things are kept from the public through various compartmentalized black projects. And I believe even if you're involved with these, the right hand probably doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And that's exactly the way that they want it. So, Dan, let's start with a little bit more about your background and what got you involved with the Disclosure Project.
Well, when I was in the United States Navy, back in 1969, that was a long time ago, I was working at the Naval Communications Station in San Francisco. I was a certified high-speed coder operator. We had a top-secret crypto level 14 clearance, so I could get into just about all the areas. One day, I received a message from a ship off the coast of Alaska where the crew visually witnessed coming off port bow a brightly glowing disc that was about 70 feet in diameter. It was glowing reddish orange. It merged out of the ocean, and then it shot straight up out of space. The radar operator on the ship tracked it going over 7,000 miles per hour. This was secret classified, going priority level, going to the Chief Naval Operations in Washington, D.C. It all stuck in my mind, so this event that happened back in 1969 has always made me wonder, if the Chief of Naval Operation knows there's these discs coming in and out of the ocean. And I find out that I thought it was an unusual event, Chris. I find out that the Soviet naval intelligences around the planet, thousands of reports of discs coming in and out of our ocean. Either they have deep under ocean bases, or they're extraterrestrial, or they're military, or joint ET military. I don't know, but there's obviously back when I you get thrown in 10 years in prison for breaking national security oath. Because of JANF 146, anybody that's in the military that reveals this stuff, they can go to prison. It wasn't until just recently that the Navy has changed its reporting protocols that it's okay now, to report an extraterrestrial craft. But it hasn't been that way all the way going back to 1954.
Yeah, definitely. And this press club event, it got very little coverage as opposed to what you thought it was going to be, right?
The being an ex-ABC newsman, and and reading off the reports from UPI and AP and everything when I was in radio and broadcasting, I had no idea who at the highest level is actually forming the text and everything on this stuff. When I went to Washington, and I'm sitting up there I am, with all these witnesses, many breaking national security oaths, captains in the Air Force, we're revealing bases on the other side of the moon, nukes being shut down. We've had zero-point energy for decades, CIA directors and presidents being denied access. Just incredible. 57 different species already been categorized by 1989. That we've already have alien reproduction vehicles that could go faster than the speed of light. All of this, I couldn't imagine. Looking at all these witnesses, it was the largest event in the history of the National Press Club. There's 22 cameras of all the major media in the back row. I'm looking at this and I'm saying, oh my God, after today, the world is not going to be the same if all this information gets out to the public. But after being on all the networks, CNN, CBS came and did a private interview with me, and I told them, look, I'm not willing to do this interview unless I can state that we have the scientists within these unacknowledged special access programs, these black projects, that can prove, put it before an open congressional hearing, that we have zero-point energy. We don't need these dangerous, obsolete technologies of nuclear, oil, or coal. We haven't needed them for decades. And basically, the only thing I asked to say is that we have these scientists. It was like a very short 10-second statement. They interviewed me for 45 minutes. The producer of the show, she was almost in tears. She said, I know I promised. They came all the way down from LA to interview me all that time. And I told them I'm not doing this unless I can say that. She said, I'm sorry, the higher executives made me cut that part out. And being an ex-ABC newsman, I started finding it curious, and I traveled across the United States with Dr. Greer in major cities. We rented huge halls. We had the executive briefing video, had standing ovations, every place without exception after the 2001 event on May 9th. They sanitized it or made fun of it, and what the CIA calls a limited hangout. In other words, it's a way to sanitize some information, but you're still technically covering it. For example, all this explosive testimony, of which any one of them, if the public got to hear what was saying in the little CNN 1-minute clip, it would. It effectively sanitized it, because what they said, oh, is there life on other planets? Some witnesses think they have proof there is. Elaine Tihana explains, and they go on like this, and they say they have documents and things, despite the criticism from skeptics. And so what they do is there's psychological think tanks that the CIA works with. There's 6 corporations that control all the media that we see and hear, are coordinated at the yearly Bilderberg meetings. And these are coordinated in such a way that billions of dollars in psychological engineering of our consent and our perceptions are given to these news reporters that we watch on the evening news that they read on their teleprompters. And so what they did to effectively sanitize this is they made it sound like we wanted to have a congressional hearing on the reality of UFOs. And this was May 9th, 2001. That was 4 months before the 9/11 event, which was one of the things that we disclosed, that it was a future false flag event that was being planned, interestingly enough.
Yes, that is very interesting. Now, let's talk about a little bit about where this control structure began and when. I mean, we can go back to ancient times, but I'm talking about this modern control structure that probably began sometime after World War II, involving Project Paperclip, and it probably culminated with Eisenhower being shut out of all the black projects, right?
Absolutely spot on, Chris. And what happened was the Nazis had a plan before the end of World War II. They knew they were losing the war. They had developed anti-gravity in 1934. The United States did not develop anti-gravity secretly until October of 1954, a whole 20-year advance that they had. And what their plan was called Weltanschauungskrieg, which translates to worldview warfare. They planned to infiltrate into the United States, control our media, control our entertainment, control our education, which they did. In 1946, Rockefeller completely rewrote the history for future students of history of what happened at the end of World War II, you know, omitting the Nazi escape and infiltration, you know. And so what happened was, with the help of Alan Dulles and other elements, they effectively infiltrated in. What happened was with Eisenhower, he's looking for plausible deniability, and so he had his vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, restructure the CIA MJ-12 operations. And so from that point forward, the operations were being done over at Wright-Patterson. They moved them all over to Area 51 and S4. Eisenhower realized that he had made a mistake, that we had lost control to our constitutional government. He attempted to gain access once they had moved their operations to Area 51. They denied him access. It wasn't until he threatened to go in with the First Army to invade the place that he allowed 2 agents to go over to see what was going on. And there was extraterrestrials there, reverse engineering craft. And so these operations have been in unacknowledged special access programs that it doesn't matter who you are, presidents, head of CIA, head of intelligence, it doesn't matter who you are, you don't gain access to these programs. And what happened was Brigadier General Stephen Lovkin was on Eisenhower's staff, and he was aware that he had lost control to the corporations. Now, you know, everybody remembers his famous farewell speech talking about, you know, to take nothing for granted, beware of the misplaced powers and unwarranted influences connected with the industrial military complex, and that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, that's your listeners out there, will help safeguard our future liberties and freedoms. What happened was, essentially, Eisenhower was forced into a surrender. They had advanced technology that they obviously, when Forrestal sent Admiral Byrd down there, he was defeated trying to take out the Nazi base down there. And also there was a flyover in 1952 over to Washington, intimidating Truman and the Eisenhower administration both. So what happened was Eisenhower, being a 5-star general and in his wisdom, he, according to some witness testimonies, that a secret executive order was put into place. Besides a secret executive order that put a whole new MJ-12 operation together of all new elements with, of all people, Alan Dulles as MJ-1, the head of MJ-12. What he did was he set up a secret U.S. Marine Corps intelligence unit that would act as an institutional safeguard in the future if these rogue infiltrated Nazi elements ever completely take over our government, and it would become active in the future. It's my speculation that the 9/11 event crossed the line, and today we're, because of the complete control of the mainstream media outlets, QAnon, which you can always tell by who the mainstream media supports and who the mainstream media tries to discredit or ignores. And they're definitely on the attack on QAnon, because it's essentially a back channel to try to communicate to the general public to let them know that military operations are underway And you can tell that by the secret executive orders, not secret, the executive orders that are open to everybody can see them, that Trump has done, of seizing assets, anybody doing human rights abuse or corruption, which is, read anybody in the cabal is involved in one of those two, and changes to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, allowing these people to be tried under military tribunal, and expanding Guantanamo Bay, and not to mention 100,000 sealed indictments that have all this is going on in the background while while we're watching the evening news and all the other stuff going on. And so what happened was, ever since Eisenhower lost control, getting back to your original question, what brought about this whole disclosure project, what happened was, once Eisenhower lost control, Kennedy tried to gain access. Allen Dulles refused him access to the MJ-12 operations. In fact, he wrote an assassination directive. It was called the Burn Memo. It was snatched out of James Jesus Angleton's counterintelligence burn pile that basically laid out a program called Project Environment, which basically said if you couldn't get any further cooperation in Washington, then assassination would be in order. In other words, in a cryptic way, saying it'll wet like blood. And so they took down Kennedy. LBJ got in place because of that. Kennedy was going to stop the Vietnam War. I had to go to combat action in Vietnam back in 1970. After Kennedy, years go by, President Carter actually had a UFO experience and actually put a report out for it. He tried to gain access. George H.W. Bush, George Bush Sr., denied a sitting president access to these files. Years later, of all people, you wouldn't associate the name Rockefeller, but Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to have disclosure and have the Clinton administration look into it. Bill Clinton, who famously said to Sarah McClendon, his White House correspondent, that in regards to why aren't you doing anything for disclosures, Sarah, there's a secret government in the government and I don't control it. He had his CIA director, James Woolsey, trying to gain access. The CIA director was denied access. So a very frustrated CIA director brought in a civilian. Dr. Stephen Greer was the president of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. He brought a huge stack of documents proving this reality. The words out of the mouth of the CIA director was, I know the subject's real. I'm trying to figure out why the hell I can't gain access to it. And so this is what's happened ever since February 1955, when Eisenhower lost control. So Dr. Greer met with military advisors. They decided, not just to get, a dozen witnesses. They get hundreds of witnesses. So they've collected about 450 witnesses. I was the 100th videotape witness. My testimony was one of the least explosive testimonies of theirs. I actually filled in for one of the other witnesses that didn't make it. So at the big turning point that happened was, interestingly enough, I was happened to be near Area 51 in 1993 when there was a meeting outside the base, and a small group of researchers, such as myself, I've been researching since 1969, trying to piece this together, why this whole thing happened. The first time Robert Lazar went public, he was a scientist over at S4 doing reverse engineering. No camera recording was allowed whatsoever, and I was sitting in front row and I recorded the full 2 hours. And you can, if you go to the webmatrix.net in the 1993 timeline, you can see the full interview. He's talking about Operation Looking Glass and all the different operations that are going on there. But what's significant about this is that the base, Nellis Base, put out a NRO, that's a National Reconnaissance Office, security advisory to telling everybody at Area 51 that the base is locked down, not to interact, or else you'll have disciplinary procedures. Anybody that communicates these people. There was a meeting that they had prior that this happened, and that this document happened to get into the hands of Dr. Stephen Greer through one of his contacts. In 1997, him, along with his military advisor, Commander Will Miller in the Navy, and astronaut Edgar Mitchell, met at the Pentagon with the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Vice Admiral Thomas Wilson. He was shown this on this distribution list. It happened to disclose what the names were of these unacknowledged special access projects, such as Cosmic Ops, Magi Ops, and so forth. The Admiral looked into this. The Admiral was denied access to this, and he was pissed. He told Dr. Greer, if you can get your people together and go before the mainstream media of the world and talk on record, in other words, each one of us, by the way, after we gave our testimony, stated that we were willing to testify under oath, that's penalty of perjury, before an open congressional hearing. Each one of us stated that. And so that is the long and short, you could say, of what brought about the May 9th, 2001 National Press Club that was effectively sanitized by our controlled mainstream media.
Very good. And we were also discussing a little bit of the history behind everything. And I want to go back to that as well for a minute. I want to go before World War II, the Nazis and the Thule Society, we hear that they were channeling the information to reverse engineer these ships themselves. Now, do you think they were actually working physically with these extraterrestrials, and what types of beings, if so, were they working with?
Well, we know that they were getting channeling. Without being there, you can't really say, if they were like Nordic beings within their group. Maria Orsic, who was head of the Virile Society that was channeling this information back in 1919 from the Albarian constellation, that were giving these designs for a design for a craft that could warp time around it. Maria Orsic's father shared these channeled writings with Professor W.O. Schumann, who was a professor at Munich, and he was just the right man to share it with. He found there was viable physics in this, and so they started working on the Virile Craft, which they were able to successfully fly the craft in 1934. But what happened was, Hitler came in power in 1933, and so Himmler and the Nazi SS, wanted to take over this whole operation. But the Virile Society was basically benevolent, doing things for a positive future for mankind versus, the Nazis. They were working with a Nordic race that look like us, only look rather Nordic looking. Unlike what according to witnesses like William Tompkins, who's a well-documented witness, there was a reptilian race that the Nazis had entered into an agreement with down in Antarctica that was getting all this amazing advanced technology, and it's why they were able to defeat Admiral Byrd when he went down there with a full military armada to attack the Nazi base.
Now, we move forward into some of these black projects, and one of the, I believe, probably the biggest tool that is being used against the American people is the mainstream media.
Absolutely.
And now we have social media as a secondary tool. It's becoming more of a primary tool, but I think those two in conjunction are like the main control matrix that is keeping everybody's mind locked down right now. But there is an awakening. There's a kickback going on right now. But, I'd like to get your thoughts on, the media. We had, Project Mockingbird, so many Black projects associated with the media and mind control that have been implemented since the 50s. Talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, Alan Dulles was infamous for not only for MK Ultra, but he started in 1950 Operation Mockingbird, where they had 400 paid journalists by the CIA that give them information to look like it's coming from independent sources. And some of the brave witnesses, unfortunately he died, they're called unofficial covers, where if they're revealed that they're actually being given information from the CIA and they're, basically working for the CIA and being paid by them, they have to disavow any knowledge of that. So it's been a network that they've set up for quite some time. In fact, the DARPA LifeLog program back in, I think it was February 2004, converted the exact same day they shut down into Facebook. The CIA basically helped fund start, Google, which owns YouTube. And so they had their mitts in this way ahead of time, because they could see that they were going to need to through certain justifications, start censoring people, have fact checkers that, they have to control the perception, as Snowden, which, Q doesn't actually reveal that he wasn't actually a white hat, was more of a black hat, but he revealed all the different, GCHQ, all the different tactics that they use in order to manipulate people's perceptions. The whole thing is, like William Binney, the head codebreaker for the NSA, said, it's nothing about terrorism or anything. It's all about, population control. It's about controlling the perceptions of the masses.
And it seems that there's different factions within factions that are kind of competing for control, for our minds, for control against perception, and just power in general. It seems like there's different agendas kind of at war behind the scenes. Is this something that you see?
Oh, no question about a war behind the scenes going on. We only see the surface effects of that war, and we get a very look at our population, how divided it is. Politically, race, religion. They want to keep the public divided, because if people start. And the good thing we have, I was listening to one of the other shows, how you're aware of our collective consciousness. We are all interfaced into a collective mind, and then they can't censor that. They can't control that, and it's scientifically proven that that's true. Just like in the insect and animal world, there's like a hive mind. Humans have a similar hive mind. That's why people can come up with similar inventions and things on one side of the planet and on the other side. In fact, ever since the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951, thousands of inventors and scientists. I spent 10 years, Chris, after a congressional hearing was denied to bring the scientists forth. I volunteered because I have a technical background. I worked with the Navy in electronics for a long time, as a broadcast engineer, and also worked with IBM's head scientist in a very unconventional laboratory, researching the interface between geometry and consciousness. What I spent 10 years doing was meeting with scientists and inventors all over the planet that claim to have over unity type energy devices. And after 10 years of murders, suicides, most of them receiving what's called a national security order, which basically states that your invention has been deemed to be a detriment to the national security of the United States. Therefore, you cannot share it with anyone, or else severe penalties. Most of the scientists that I know have received one of these, or, like one in the Dominican Republic. I went down there with Professor Loiter, and we were looking at it, and it's like 500 watts was being produced, less than 1 watt going out. It went fly back down there, and the inventor had taken it all apart, disassembled it. I was there to blueprint it out, and we were going to send it via multiple postal ways in case we get whacked on the way back. We'd be able to have the design. What he said was 2 agents that identified themselves from the CIA anyway. I can't say whether it's true or not, but they told him, this works, you're dead. And so he disassembled the whole thing. And that's just one story, and I can go into so many stories on that. But essentially, they have kept our planet technologically hijacked, going all the way back to at least 1951.
Now, speaking of that, we have technologies that are essentially 50, maybe more years ahead of what the public sees right now. And it's, like Ben Rich said, it's tied up in all these black projects. Do you think that with everything going on, like there's this war that you said is possibly going on behind the scenes, do you think that we will ever see any of these free energy technologies, anything that's locked up in black projects right now, in our lifetime?
If we can, and we are, taking these people who are in positions of power in our different structures, and they've been doing, notice how many FBI and different elements have all been resigning, and people stepping down and all this stuff. You need to clean house first before we can release this, or else you're still going to have the corrupt elements that are maintaining the stranglehold on all this. But yes, absolutely. I mean, they have not only anti-gravity and free energy, which we need to release, zero-point energy, because if we ever get a CME from the sun or an EMP attack, it would basically fry our grid. Millions of people would perish because everything would be shut down. It wouldn't have anything. But if we can start mass production of these, and we can do that, and it may be affordable for every home and business, that have a little small device about the size of a shoebox that'll power all the kilowatts you need, totally clean, non-polluting, and we can completely recycle all these ugly wires that are run all across our planet and do something else with them. That would, it's one thing we need to do is harden the grid, with surge suppression, diverters and stuff, because we get that influx coming in, the transformers will explode, and, just everything will, it wouldn't be good. So, that's another reason why we should release these technologies. But, like J.P. Morgan says, if I don't want to see it if I can't put a meter on it.
And you and I were discussing this before we started, speaking of false flag events and these distraction operations, I was asking you what your thoughts on the coronavirus is. And you have a take on it that it's probably maybe the last-ditch deep state effort to kind of hold on to control.
Can't say for certain. A lot of very, very suspicious elements going on with the whole, anybody who researches this sees the connections with these people in China and the viral weapons lab over there in China, and the same Wuhan city, and Wuhan just happens to be the 5G test city that they're doing. There's just a whole lot of suspicious elements. You can't really say for sure, but it's important to pay attention to suspicious elements. And it does appear that, we have, William Barr working with John Huber. He's got 470 investigators that are investigating a whole lot of people. We've got Admiral Mike Rogers in charge of the White Hats are in charge of the NSA, and so they basically, they have the goods on everybody. And so I think what's happening is just before all this comes out, which appears to be probably pretty soon, they are like a dangerous animal backed into the corner and are liable to play any card that they have.
Yeah, it's there's definitely some nefarious things being played around this coronavirus, whether it was intentionally released or not. They're using it, to push agendas. That's 100% sure. At least what I can see. Now, I want to get back to the secret space program. How far do you think it goes? Do you think we currently have operations on the moon and possibly on Mars?
Well, according to witness testimonies, that what I do is I look back, and it was like the beginning of 2014, Chris, that I started to really dig in and research, because some media company out of Hollywood, knowing I was an ABC newsman and a witness, they wanted me to write, me of all people, a terrible writer, to write an article on the media control. And I wrote an article called "Who Controls the Agreed Upon Reality Through the Mainstream Media and Why They Fear Disclosing the Truth About the Extraterrestrial Reality." And so as I started to dig back, basing as a foundational structure, because anybody can write anything on the internet, you can just pull it out of where, so I based my research on, of the hundreds of witnesses that I've, some of them I know, and I'm familiar with their testimonies. I've researched documents that have been authenticated. And you put all these witness testimonies together and look at it, do it chronologically. That's how in order for me to try to understand what I became involved with and what this whole thing, why it is doing what it is doing, why we are in the state our world is today, I had to go back to the year 1900 to present day and start plugging in things along the timeline with documents and witness testimonies to try to get a larger picture of how this whole thing came about. And I'm sorry, what was the question again? I mean to go off.
I was asking if how deep you think our secret space program goes, if we possibly have operations currently on the moon or on Mars.
Well, apparently, the Nazis got a moon base going up there around 1942. It was later that joint operations, got operations going on Mars. You've got two witnesses that, you have a lot of secret space program witnesses, but they can't really provide any documentation. They can't really, it's a hard one to prove, to say, I was recruited using this Nordic technology, that I did 20 years duty service on another timeline. They brought me back, and, and it's a far reach for people to wrap their head around that, considering our current state of technology, that such things exist. But you've got two witnesses that are hard to deny. One was after the 2001 event that I partaked in. It inspired a hacker in the UK, Gary McKinnon, who hacked into the Space Command, and they've got a photo of a huge cigar-shaped ship talking about Operation Solar Warden. We have non-terrestrial officers, fleet-to-fleet transfers. The Bush administration wanted to put him away for 70 years in prison. He had no reason whatsoever to lie about this. And then you have, who came out in the year 2001, the same year that the press conference, William Tompkins, who was in the Navy, working with a spy program, got permission from Admiral Hugh Webster, who looked at all the documentation that he had in his book, wanted to make sure there was nothing classified that could get out. And he told William, Bill, tell it all. Don't leave anything out. It's most important to the future of our country. And William Tompkins, I worked with Dr. Michael Sell on some of this, trying to locate. Interestingly enough, my father worked at the Naval Air Station in San Diego back in the 40s, back when Tompkins was meeting with these Navy spies that were embedded, 29 of them over in Nazi Germany, that were bringing back this information and hieroglyphics and things that were of the, the Draco Federation was supplying to the Nazis. These young Navy spies were coming back with this information. He would be sitting with the secretaries and he'd be typing this stuff up. And his main job was to fly. And Dr. Sala was able to go through a Freedom of Information Act and was able to find the travel chits that he used to fly to, like McDonnell Douglas and other corporations, where we were 20 years behind the Nazis. We're attempting to catch up. We were trying to understand the technologies that they had. And William Tompkins has a lot of backup documentation to substantiate his claims. So those are the two people I would say are rock solid as far as, that there is indeed a secret space program going on.
What are your thoughts on what's going on recently with, I guess you could say, disclosure? It's a kind of controlled disclosure that I don't really trust. The TTSA and some of the information coming out of there, some of the recent leaks that have come out. You have to look at the source and question it, but I'd like to get your take on it.
Well, interesting you bring that up. Dr. Michael Sala had a new post that on exopolitics.org about a U.S. Air Force intelligence officer that basically claimed that the Tic Tac, of the 2004 Nimitz incident, where they saw this 40-foot giant Tic Tac, I guess you could say, was darting around doing maneuvers that, just off the scale. Is actually a U.S. Air Force secret space program that was working in collaboration with the United States Navy, and they were testing out their radar. Of course, the sailors and everybody didn't know what the hell was going on. They just figured it was extraterrestrial. Apparently, something with Luis Elizondo there and the Advanced Aerial Threat Identification System, whatever it is, the AATIP, I think it is. They basically, again, remember I said earlier, it's important to pay attention to who. Now, if you consider the mainstream media is infiltrated heavily and is running by an agenda that is not set for the benefit for the people of the United States, that what happened was, when the New York Times, one of the head, along with CNN, Washington Post, and several others, of all their controlled outlets, all of a sudden got saturated with the Nimitz incident of 2004, about the Navy pilots, and seeing this stuff in every single media outlet across the board. And you're talking dozens and dozens of them, the mainstream media outlets. So that, even covering it for 2 or 3 days. And so that essentially even your grandmother knows about UFOs being acknowledged by our government. But then again, and you get so much support. Then they come out then on the History Channel with the series called Unidentified. And all throughout the narrative, if you've probably watched some of the episodes, the word threat, the UFO threat, is like continually propagated to put the mind of the threat. And we know from along the line, how would a threat serve an agenda? Well, back in 1967, there was a report from Iron Mountain that leaked, and they talked about contriving a threat from outer space in order to do the agenda. LBJ hit the roof, classified for all time. 1977, Wernher von Braun talked about the future false flag programs. There was first was the Soviets, which we find out that the whole Soviet thing was, when you consider that you have General Reinhard Gehlen, who they brought in with Allen Dulles into the CIA with 3,000 Nazi spies. They had all the intelligence on the Soviets, right? And we didn't have that. Truman was scared of the Soviets. And so what they cleverly did, they hid all their intelligence into these sealed glass containers up in the Bavarian mountains. They use it as a bargaining chip to bring all these Nazi spies into our CIA. And not to mention they gave new paperwork for everybody, even people who were classified as a definite threat and menace to our society, like Wernher von Braun and others. He was basically given new paperwork, and they all were brought in. And so what was happening was they were giving false estimates about the Soviets all the time, because this way, and it was Allen Dulles who pushed Truman to convert the old wartime OSS into the CIA. And so they could justify bringing in all this money, all these billions and dollars in order to fight the Soviet threat, you know. And then you have, what was after that? You know, eventually, you know, on May 9th, 2001 was just before the terrorist event, which was one of the events that they planned, with ending in a extraterrestrial threat. And then in 2016, because Hillary was afraid she was going to be losing the election, Anonymous leaked a Benson strategy group working with the Clinton Foundation that was going to use Project Firesign, I believe, which is basically a holographic technology. They estimated all these different things because they knew Trump was going to win. And so they needed to have some kind of huge tactic in order to distract these people from going to the voting. And so they had viruses. They had the one that got the highest percentage was like 38% was an attack from extraterrestrials. Can you believe it or not? And so this little, and we know they have the technology to pull this off, you know, so this has been a common theme through this whole thing. So I look at the whole Tom DeLonge To the Stars Academy with, you know, all these people who were, you know, CIA, Air Force, Lockheed. You know, when you know very well, as you mentioned earlier, you know, Ben Rich said, you know, anything you can imagine, you know, we already know how to do. So why are they asking for money for research and development? You know, so if you have these things that you know, they say would take an act of God in order to get it out to benefit humanity.
Yes, definitely. It's very sad that we could have all this access to free energy, that we could be thriving as a planet right now with just even access, if we would have gone along the lines of the technologies Tesla was working on. You know, we could have a much better way of life right now. But for the last few minutes that we have, I know you have had actually some personal experiences besides the UFO encounter. Isn't that right?
Yes, back in 1977, I had an interesting encounter with a being that conveyed an amazing experience of the Kundalini opening about geometry and consciousness that led me to seek out the head scientist at IBM who was working with the structuring of water and quartz crystals and cutting them. He set up a whole laboratory with electron microscope, Dr. Marcel Vogel. You can see my lab notes on that at marcelvogel.org. Amazing stuff. I even handled the metals crystal samples that were given to Billy Meyer. We were analyzing those to see if they were of earthly origin or not, and they were not. But who knows? There's a whole bunch of things that happened in the 50s that indicates that the Nazis were seeing how easily we could be fooled, and pretending to be space brothers from Venus, but they were actually Nazis from Antarctica.
Well, could you take us through that experience and tell us a little bit about what exactly happened with this being?
Well, as I had my eyes closed, and I had millions of volts going through my hands and feet, and this being, incredible loving energy coming from its eyes, huge, one of those, I didn't even know what a gray looked like back then, it is 1977, this is, a lot of this is very
Were you
new
just
to me.
at your home or
At my home, and a lady who I was going out with, she owned a metaphysical bookstore. She was meant to put me through a past life regression, and things just went a whole different direction. But the thing that's curious about this is that I never studied geometry. I didn't know anything about geometry, in high school or anything. And as I observed this being projected a sphere in space, and as I observed the sphere, a geometry formed inside the sphere, and it looked like a six-pointed star. And later I'm thinking, oh yeah, it's like a star tetrahedron, and then another pattern fit into that one, and then another one went into that one, and it kept on going into infinity, and then it turned back into a perfect sphere again. And the being was, this is some type of alien high-speed download or something. I don't know. It could be metamorphic. That's the right word. But basically, it's conveying that through love, we evolve from one frequency geometry. In actuality, we're all a perfect sphere. We're all connected as in a matrix. And through, we can become aware of the subharmonic levels of the geometry, but not of the higher levels until we evolve and encompass that. And the vehicle of love is how we do that. And afterward, I was left with this burning desire to try to understand everything I could about geometry. And I started getting into books, and I started seeing, what every high school kid knows about platonic solids and how they fit one into the other. And I was saying, all of a sudden, this is like, oh my God, this is exactly what the being was conveying. And then it was, when I was meeting with scientists and inventors, there was a meeting in 2001 in San Francisco with a number of scientists that had their projects shut down. People come in with electric motorcycles with night vision goggles and shut down their lab. So a group of scientists, one of the scientists, his name was Nassim Haramein, and he was showing me on his laptop. We were sitting in this home in San Francisco with these, Dr. Greer arranged the meeting, and he was showing me his energy device. And I just felt like I wanted to share with him my experience. And I explained it in detail to him, and he says, yes, that's it. That's exactly it. That's the structure. Of course, in 2001, I didn't have an understanding. It was many years later I started understanding, researching science connected with the geometry of matter, the atomic structures, the planets, the geometries within all the heavenly bodies. And, the whole thing is so... if you go to marcelvogel.org, you can click on, and I put basically a listing of all the connections of that experience that triggered me into research work with Dr. Vogel back in 1977. Very odd, bizarre experience, but it definitely put a burning passion in to try to understand what this is about.
Definitely. And for the last few minutes you have, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the research that you did with Dr. Marcel Vogel?
Well, well, we found that it gets into kind of a, there's a thing called angular harmonic resonance that happens between the molecular structure of water and quartz, that both water and quartz have hexagonal and tetrahedral geometries, and there's a transfer between them. I mean, this would go into, it's enough for another show, but for example, we were go to a winery that had this rot gut wine and was able to put the finished process of a high quality wine by transferring it, by spinning around the crystal, this wine that was this rot gut wine that after it got done, he did thousands of gallons and it won a California award. It just one application that we're doing. There's many more things, but we have to do another show for that sometime.
Definitely. I'd look forward to doing that. And Dan, thank you so much for coming on tonight. Before you head out, let people know if they're interested in your research. Where can they find your website, social media, anything else like that?
Yes, my notes online that I share chronologically is at thewebmatrix.net, not .com, but .net. And research with Dr. Vogel was marcelvogel.org. I'm on Facebook on facebook.com/disclosure witness for your DARPA LifeLog connections. And let's see. Yeah, this is the only reason I do these shows, Chris, is that we could have had a whole different world by now. We could have been to all the planets. We could have had free energy. The world could be thriving with these technologies that not only in health, we wouldn't need these pharmaceutical companies that have basically evolved out of IG Farben, out of Nazi Germany. There is... my great-grandfather was the president of a homeopathic medical society that was going up against Rockefeller back in the early 1920s. There's a whole different world that we could be experiencing right now. And I think this great awakening is our key to, saying, hey, we're aware, we're ready to change this. We know what the story is.
Very well said, and I agree, and I hope you're right about that this war behind the scenes is going to really take out all the scum that's on the earth and give us a chance, kind of pave the way for this free energy and all these technologies that we've been needing to have released from the public.
Everybody contributes to this. Everybody in their own little way. On social media, talking to your friends and family. All contributing to the collective awakening of this, and the more you base your research on the facts that have been hidden, you'll go one oh my god after another, and you realize that what sounds like we've been fed science fiction all these years, but what's really going on behind the scenes is far beyond any science fiction fantasy, and it needs to be released for the good of everyone.
Definitely. And Dan, thank you so much again for coming on. And like you said, we have a whole nother show to talk about with your research with Dr. Marcel Vogel. So we'll have you back on to talk about that. And you have a great rest of your night.
I look forward, Chris. I enjoyed having this great conversation with you.